Metaphysical Poetry. John Dryden said in his discourse concerning satire, 1693, that John Donne in his poetry affects the metaphysics. He meant that Donne employed the terminology and abstruse arguments of the medieval scholastic philosophers. In 1779, Dr. Johnson extended the term metaphysical. Dr. Johnson referred to a school of poets. He intended the adjective to be pejorative. He attacked the poets' lack of feeling, their learning, and the surprising range of images and comparisons they used. The name is applied now to a group of 17th-century poets who, whether or not directly influenced by Donne, employed similar poetic procedures and imagery both in the secular and in the religious poetry. A drastic revaluation in the fame of the metaphysical poets was brought by T.S. Eliot's essay on the metaphysical poets. They are highly recognized for their conceits. They have been influential in recent British poetry and criticism. Chief characteristics: they used contemporary scientific discoveries and theories, topical debates on humanism, faith, and eternity, colloquial speech-based rhythms, and innovative verse forms, to examine the relationship between the individual, his God and the universe. Their conceits, metaphors, and images, paradoxes and intellectual complexities to make the poems a constant challenge to the readers. Particularly, Donne and Herbert presented contrasts in their poems. Their emphasis on sensuality and pleasure seems to conflict with their profoundly religious concerns and experiences. They explored the reflections of their own experiences in religion. Their poetry is an expression of their values on conflict between religion and secular reality, and faith and doubt. The new discoveries of science, geography, and astronomy find expression in their poetry. In one of his divine poems entitled Hymn to God My God, in My Sickness, Donne compares his doctors to cosmographers and himself to their map. Donne employed humor in the conceits. For example, he describes his mistress as his new-found land. The direct address to God, to the Son and to the reader is a characteristic part of their poetry and their challenge to their own positions in relation to society, to their self-perceptions, to love and to religion. Their poetry used common poetic style. It indicates the use of figurative language in organizing a deep meditative process. Their poems are sharply opposed to the rich mellifluousness and the idealized view of human nature and of sexual love which had constituted a central position in Elizabethan poetry. God, human nature, religion, love, and death were chief themes of their poetry. These themes are reflected in a modern revolutionary ways. In their poetry, they employed a subtle, deliberately outrageous logic. They treated the human motives and its complex nature in a realistic, ironical and sometimes in a cynical way. John Donne and George Herbert can be seen as experimenters both in poetic form and the subject matter they used. They were also innovators in linguistic directness of expression. Their poetry reflected the intellectual and spiritual challenges of an age which wanted to expand human horizons. Metaphysical Poets 1. John Donne. Donne became the man of church after his career in poetic affairs. His poetry reflected the conflict between religion and secular reality and faith and doubt. His interests including the new discoveries of science, geography, and astronomy finds expression in his poems. In one of his poems Hymn to God My God, in My Sickness, he compares his doctors to cosmographers and himself to the map. His use of conceit was remarkable. In one of his poems, he describes his mistress as his new-found land. Flee, death be not proud, hymn to God, my God, in my sickness and better my heart. Three-person D God are his remarkable poems which reflect his self-perceptions on love, religion, death, and God. His conceptions were modern. Donne set the metaphysical mode by writing poems which are sharply opposed to the rich mellifluousness and idealized view of human nature and of sexual love, depicted in Elizabethan poetry of Spenser, Shakespeare, and Sidney. To George Herbert, although his poems can appear simple, sometimes taking the pictorial form of their subjects such as an altar or wings, Herbert's arguments with his God can be tortuous and complex. He moves between faith and doubt, acceptance and rejection, in a way which echoes the struggle in his own life to abandon the possibility of civic advancement in favor of a quiet life as a country parson. One of his best poems, The Collar itself a significant metaphor, opens with an outraged shout of defiance in which the poet refuses to submit to God's will. Both John Donne and George Herbert were experimenters in poetic form and the subject matter they used. They were the innovators in linguistic directness of experience. They reflect in poetry the intellectual and spiritual challenge of an age which wanted to expand human horizons. 3. Henry Vaughan. In Vaughan's poetry, there is less of the anguish, struggle, and negotiation found in Herbert. He presented a world of innocence, bordering on the mystical. He is a poet of flowers, clouds, of childhood innocence and shadows of eternity. It is notable that the 20th-century novelist Forrest Reed used the title of one of Vaughan's best poems, The Retreat, for the central novel of a trilogy on childhood and the loss of innocence. Silex Scintillans, 1650, is the first major volume of his poems. For Thomas Carew, he wrote many lyrics and songs. His tone is more cynical than his friend Sir John Suckling. He is first noted for an elegy to John Donne. His poems, 1640, ranges from the erotic to the satirical and express passion vividly. 5. Thomas Traherne. He is also compared to Walt Whitman, a 19th-century American poet, for his unconventional, exuberant verse forms. Traherne was a devout man who worked in the sphere of antiquities, publishing Roman forgeries in 1673, which documented the falsification of church documents by the Church of Rome in the 9th century. His poems were published after his death in Christian Ethics, 1675, Centuries, 1694, Poetical Works, 1903, and Select Meditations, 1908. Like Vaughan, he gives a highly original depiction of childhood experiences and stresses the need for the adult to return to an appreciation of childhood simplicity. He explores the infinite possibilities of the human mind and spirit, finding, in a way, a concept of God in his vastness of human potentiality. Life is all. 6. Richard Crashaw. Richard Crashaw is an unusual case. Son of a Puritan clergyman, he converted to Catholicism at the age of 33 in the mid-1640s and had to flee the country. His poetry is religious, and is exaggerated in style and expression, making him perhaps the most Baroque of English religious writers. His main themes are ecstasy and martyrdom. Steps to the Temple, 1646, and Carmen Deo Nostro, 1652, contain most of his poems. Crashaw has a mastery of verse form and an ability to match natural language and heightened emotion with vivid imagery and a highly personalized view of religion and suffering. 7. Andrew Marvell. he is the only metaphysical poet who spans the early and the latter part of the 17th century. His poetry ranges from political to passionate. An Horathian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland was written in 1650 to celebrate the triumph of the Commonwealth. To His Coy Mistress is Marvell's well-known poem. It brings the Renaissance themes of love and transience.